Let's start with the definition of hormones. Hormones are chemical signals that are released into the blood in order to affect the activities of other cells. Hormones are typically released in response to some sort of signal or stimulus in the body. This could be a signal from a nerve, this could be a hormone from a different endocrine gland, or it could be some sort of change in body conditions, a change in levels of ions or nutrients, or blood pressure, or other sort of body condition. There are three basic classes of hormones, or types of hormones. The first are the steroid hormones. We talked about these a little bit before when we were talking about lipids. Steroid hormones are made from cholesterol, which means they are non-polar. These non-polar molecules don't travel very easily in the blood because the blood is mostly water. Non-polar hormones have to bind to some sort of a carrier that kind of helps it along as it's in the blood. However, because it is nonpolar, once it gets to its target cells, it doesn't need any help getting into the cell. These hormones will just wiggle their way into the target cell and then bind to receptors inside the target cell in order to affect the activity of the cell. Some examples of steroid hormones would be testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol. The second type of hormones are the monoamines, also called the amine hormones. These are called monoamines or amine hormones because they're made from a single amino acid. You start with one amino acid and modify it slightly and it becomes a hormone. These types of hormones are polar because amino acids are polar. That means that they're transported easily through the blood because they can dissolve in water, but they can't get across the plasma membrane. So amine hormones have to bind to receptors on the surface of the cell, and then the receptor will cause a change in the activity of the cell. Some common examples of monoamine hormones are epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. A third class of hormones are the peptide hormones. As the name suggests, these are made from strings of amino acids. We join a number of amino acids together, like we would if we were making a polypeptide to create a protein, and we have a peptide hormone, a string of amino acids. Peptide hormones tend to be very polar, so they will be transported easily in the blood without help, but again, they won't be able to cross the plasma membrane. So they, like amine hormones, will bind to receptors on the surface of the cell, and the receptor will change the activity inside the cell. Insulin, growth hormone, and oxytocin are examples of peptide hormones. Because hormones are released into the bloodstream, they travel to the whole body. Once a hormone has been released, it's going to end up everywhere in the body. But these hormones only affect their target cells, the specific cells that they are supposed to affect. The specificity of the hormone, how it only finds its specific target cells, is because of the receptor. Target cells for a certain hormone will have a receptor for that hormone. Cells that are not affected by the hormone will not have receptors for that hormone. If we consider something like oxytocin, which we know is released into the bloodstream and will go everywhere in the body in order to stimulate contraction of the uterus, it doesn't stimulate contraction of all the other muscles in the body because the uterine muscle cells have receptors for oxytocin, and the rest of the muscle cells in the body don't have receptors for oxytocin. So it's the presence of the receptor on the target cell that determines which cells are going to be affected by a hormone and which aren't. In this figure, we can see some cells releasing hormones. This cell is releasing blue hormones. These are polar, either monoamine or peptide hormones, that are going to circulate through the body until they find cells that have the receptor that they can bind to. Here at the bottom is a target cell, and you can see that it has a receptor on the surface that the blue hormone is able to bind to. This other cell is releasing a steroid hormone. Remember that steroid hormones are able to cross over the membrane and go into the cell, and they bind to receptors on the inside of the cell. And here you can see one of those intracellular receptors that the steroid hormone can bind to affect this cell. If this was not a target cell for this particular hormone, it wouldn't have the receptor. Let's take a closer look at hormone receptors. As I mentioned before, polar hormones like monoamines or peptide hormones can't cross the plasma membrane, so they have to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. Once the hormone binds to the receptor then affects the activity inside the cell. This involves what's called a second messenger system, where we activate other messengers inside the cell that then travel throughout that cell to change its activity. Non-polar hormones, like steroid hormones on the other hand, are able to simply cross the plasma membrane on their own and then bind to a receptor inside the cell. This intracellular receptor can then affect the cell's activity. But what do I mean when I say it can affect the cell's activity? So now we're getting to the real effects of hormones. Once we've activated the receptor, once the hormone binds to the receptor, what does it actually do? That depends a lot on the hormone and the receptor, but there are several types of things that hormones do to change the activity of a cell. A hormone may result in activating or inactivating an enzyme to change the rate of a reaction, either to make something happen faster or to stop it from happening. A hormone may affect transport proteins, either by increasing the number of transport proteins so we can transport more of something into or out of a cell, or by reducing the amount of transport so we're not releasing or bringing things into the cell. Often, hormones are involved in regulating RNA or protein synthesis. The hormone effects will go to the nucleus of the cell and actually affect which genes are being expressed, which proteins are being made. So a hormone binding to its receptor can change the proteins being made by a cell, and that can affect a lot of different things. Because hormones can affect so many different things, it's very important that hormone levels are carefully regulated. We need to make sure we have enough of the hormones we need, but not too much. This regulation has to be very precise because even a little bit of a hormone can have a big effect. And that's because of how tightly hormones like to bind to their receptors. It only takes a little bit to have a big effect. In most cases, hormone levels are regulated by negative feedback. This negative feedback can work in a couple of different ways. So let's say a condition gets out of range, so we release a hormone to correct that condition. Once the condition is corrected, there's no more stimulus for the release of the hormone, so the hormone isn't released any longer. This is how it works with insulin released from the pancreas. When the blood sugar level gets too high, that's detected by the pancreas, which releases insulin. Insulin then reduces the blood sugar level, and when the blood sugar level is lower, no more insulin is released, and that reduces the levels of insulin in the body. Sometimes the negative feedback is even more direct, because often the presence of a hormone in the body inhibits or stops the release of more of that hormone. This is how we regulate the level of thyroid hormone in the body. We always need some thyroid hormone in the body, but we don't want too much and we don't want too little. The hypothalamus actually starts this process by releasing a hormone called thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus then goes to the pituitary gland. That causes the pituitary gland to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. But once there's enough thyroid hormone in the blood, thyroid hormone goes back up to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and stops them from releasing the stimulating hormones. That stops the release of more thyroid hormone. If the thyroid hormone level gets too low, then there's not enough thyroid hormone to stop the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which will then release the thyrotropin-releasing hormone and the thyroid-stimulating hormone, so we get more thyroid hormone. Once there's enough thyroid hormone, it goes up and turns off those stimulating hormones in the brain. Negative feedback. Negative feedback is a great way to keep us from releasing more of a hormone, but we also have to have mechanisms to clear out hormones that are already present. Once a hormone has been released, we don't want it to remain active in the body forever. We want to release the hormone so it has its effect, and then clear the hormone out of the body until we need it again. There are 3 different mechanisms that can help clear hormones out of the blood. The first is the target cells themselves. When the hormone binds to the target cell will often activate endocytosis to bring that hormone into the cell, and then it can be destroyed. So the target cells can help remove hormones from the blood. A second mechanism of removing hormones from the blood is through the liver. Your liver has a lot of different enzymes that can help break down hormones. So once a hormone is released, it's circulating through the body, including to the liver, and whatever hormone the liver gets, it can break down with enzymes. The final clearance mechanism, and one that's very common and important, is the urinary system. As your blood filters through your kidneys, hormones are filtered out and they go into the urine and you pee them away. That's why urine tests can be used to look for a number of different types of hormones, including the hormones that are released when you're pregnant or ovulating, which is how ovulation test kits and pregnancy tests work. They're looking for the presence of the hormones that are being removed in the urine.